Chris with Coldbreak here with another customer question. We had a guy call the other day and ask specifically about coil length. And his question was, I want to make sure that I'm buying the correct coil length for the jockey box and for my specific needs. And generally when we get that question, I have to start at the beginning because you have to understand why you're choosing that coil length. When you're talking about a mobile draft setup like a jockey box or a jumper box, you're typically going to find three options. One is a cold plate, which is an aluminum block that's got tubing inside of it. The second one is a stainless steel coil. And the third one is, the first one's a 50-foot stainless steel coil. And the second one is typically a 100 or 120-foot coil. The 120-foot coils are typically 100 feet of 5/16 or 3/8 inch tubing. And then it's choked down another 20 feet with like 3/16 inch tubing. Now, when you're trying to decide between the three, it's important to know why. So when you're talking about a draft system, there's balanced systems and there's unbalanced systems, and it all has to do with carbonation and PSI. So when you tap, we'll start at the beginning and we'll talk about a balanced system, which would be a kegerator, a short draw draft system in a bar or brewery, or a long draw draft system in a bar or brewery where the keg is far away from where the bartender actually pours the drink. In a balanced system, you hook that keg up to the system and the PSI puts 10 to 12 PSI onto the keg. And when the line is balanced to the length from the keg to the tap, and then when you pull the tap handle, you're basically pouring at a certain rate, which is, you're trying to get rid of that 10 to 12 PSI, and so you wind up at 0 at the tap or 1 PSI at the tap. And that's a balanced system that maintains the carbonation level of the keg no matter how long you leave it, right? So you can tap that beer and a month later, the carbonation level is going to remain the same. That carbonation level is typically set by the brewery, whether it's 2.4, 2.5, or 2.6 volumes of CO2. When you go to a temporary draft system, it's an unbalanced system, meaning that you're not going to tap that keg for very long, right? So it's going to be an afternoon, it's going to be an evening, it's going to be for a wedding or something. So you've got a few hours that you're just going to tap the keg. That's it, and you're going to pour it and be done with it. With a temporary draft system like a jockey box or a jumper box, all you're really doing is taking that short draw or long draw draft system, in this case, it's typically a long draw draft system, and you're shoving it down into a cooler. All that coil length creates resistance, and so you've got to overcome that resistance. In order to overcome that resistance, you have to crank the PSI on the keg. That means it's unbalanced, which means the keg's at 20, like on a 50-foot coil, 25 to 30 PSI is typically where you're pouring. And so there's a lot of pressure on top of that keg. Now, when we talk about cold plates, what I've seen is from what I know, it's like the manufacturers say that there's anywhere between 11 to 18 feet of tubing inside of a cold plate, meaning you're only getting about 3 to 4 ounces of liquid cold at a time. So cold plates are very inefficient and you're not getting much cold. We don't sell cold plates for that specific reason. If you're pouring samples at a beer festival, that might be an okay way to go, but typically you're pouring 12 to 16 ounces of a draft beer. And for that reason, you want to go up to a 50-foot coil. That's like the sweet spot, right? And so with a 50-foot coil, you need 25 to 30 PSI. If you go longer, 100-foot coil, you're typically in the range of 35 to 40 PSI, and that's a lot of pressure on a keg. 25 to 30 is a lot of pressure on a keg, but 100-foot coil is even more. And so a lot of people's thought process is, well, I've got to need a 100-foot coil because if 50 foot's good, 100 feet's even better. And so I've got all this beer inside this coil that I can dispense, and it's already cold and it's ready to go. But they're not really thinking about the PSI needed at the keg. And so the longer the event you're at and the higher the pressure that your keg's at, the more risk you have of overcarbonating that keg. So if that keg's really cold, that cold beer is going to absorb that CO2 really quickly. And so we typically tell people that the sweet spot is a 50-foot coil. If you're jockey box or jumper box is set up properly, meaning that when you hook everything up, you put ice, you fill your cooler all the way up, you run beer through it prior to filling it with ice, and then you walk away for 10 or 15 minutes so that your jockey box, like the cooler gets cold, the shanks get cold, the faucets get cold, and everything is just kind of acclimates itself. When you go back to that jockey box and you pour it off, like you're gonna get a perfect pour every time. So it's a lot of it has to do with proper setup, and then also maintaining that ice inside your jockey box. Your jockey box ice melt will depend on how warm your keg is, the ambient temperature. I mean, obviously, the warmer the keg, the faster your ice is going to melt. And then as that like ice melt, let's say this is the coil, and as the ice melts, the ice can have a tendency to kind of pull away from the coil. And if you don't get in there and move the ice around a little bit, where the ice isn't actually touching the coil, you can run into foaming issues there as well, because the ice actually isn't doing its job anymore. A lot of people try to overcome that with water, so you can put a little bit of water in there, but like if it's not really necessary. If you just move the ice around every once in a while, it'll keep the weight down, and it just helps with cleanup and stuff. So 50 feet. When we go to an event, 50-foot coil is all we take. Right, we've been doing this for 13 years, and I don't think I've ever taken a jockey box with a 100-foot coil to an event. It's all about proper setup and maintaining the ice level inside of it, and making sure that the ice is touching the coils. Then keeping your kegs cool. You don't necessarily have to keep them ice cold, but as long as they're cool and out of direct sunlight, you should be okay. So 50-foot coil is the sweet spot. That's what we like, and that's what we would recommend. If you have any questions, reach out to us, support@Coldbreak USA, and let me know your comment. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks.